In December 1944, a German staff sergeant searched the pockets of a dead American soldier. He found a branded bar of soap and a letter written 9 days prior. This was not what he had been told to expect, but that is not the whole story. These small items were a verdict delivered from an unbombed continent. This truth, admitted in interrogations, was largely overlooked. This is not speculation. In spring 1945, American interrogation units processed thousands of captured German officers and enlisted men. These were captains, lieutenants, and sergeants. They formed the shattered middle ranks of a broken army. Interrogators asked a standard question. They wanted to know when these men personally understood the war was lost. Expected answers came up. They mentioned the bombing of German cities. They cited the Russian advance. They spoke of the death of friends. They noted the collapse of supply. But another category of answer kept appearing. The interrogators kept hearing it. They had to file this category separately in their reports. This other category centered on the pockets. Captured Germans said they understood the war was lost when they took a thermos of real coffee. They found it from a downed American pilot behind German lines. They themselves had endured months of ersatz brew. They had drunk nothing but it. Others understood when they overran an American outpost. They found radios, maps, and ammunition. They also found a complete dry change of clothing for every man. This included spare wool socks. One recurring observation was a bar of toilet soap. It was wrapped in commercial packaging with a brand name on the wrapper. This was in a war zone. It was the middle of the worst winter in Europe in a generation. The pattern was consistent enough. American interrogation reports flagged it as a recurring theme. Enlisted German prisoners asked the standard question about the moment they understood the war was lost, pointed to these small material details. They found them on American prisoners, casualties, or captured supplies. This was more often than they pointed to any specific battlefield event. Senior German officers held under different conditions said similar things in private. In a converted English country house north of London called Trent Park, the British Military Intelligence Service held these officers. They had held them since 1942. They recorded their conversations without their knowledge. The transcripts now run to roughly 50,000 pages. They are one of the richest sources we have for what German generals actually thought. This is as opposed to what they later wrote in their carefully edited post-war memoirs. Among the prisoners at Trent Park was Hans-Jürgen von Arnim. He was a German colonel-general. He had surrendered in Tunisia in May 1943. He spent more than a year in British custody. He was then shipped to a prisoner of war camp in Mississippi. In the recordings preserved by the British listeners, the captured German officers returned often to the question of American material superiority. They had seen the captured American supplies in Tunisia. They had read the reports from the Western Front. They had eaten captured American rations themselves before being taken to England. The conclusion these men reached in private conversations mirrored the enlisted men's conclusion. They did not know they were being recorded. The supplies were not the problem. The supplies were the symptom. The problem was the country behind the supplies. A country that could fill those pockets, item by item, was a country an army could not defeat. The pattern was not the chocolate. It was the fact that the chocolate could be there at all. It was the fact that an army on the other side of an ocean 3,000 miles deep into a global war could afford to give every private soldier a 4-ounce sealed bar of cocoa and sugar. He might never need to eat it. That kind of margin was not a battlefield fact. It was a national fact. A country with that kind of margin was not really an opponent. It was a different category of thing. This was the situation in December 1944. German soldiers in the Ardennes bent down to search. They examined the pockets of the American dead. The contrast had not always been so brutal. There had been a moment much earlier in the war. The Germans had first seen the inside of an American supply system. They had not known quite what to make of it. The moment came in February 1943. It was in the dust and rocks of central Tunisia. The maps marked the place as Kasserine Pass. The Americans there were inexperienced. Their tactics in their first major engagement against the German Afrika Korps were poor. Their commanders were poor. Over 5 days of fighting, the German and Italian forces under the operational direction of Erwin Rommel broke them. American losses ran to about 6,500 men. These were killed, wounded, captured, or missing. Hundreds of tanks, half-tracks and trucks were also lost. By every battlefield measure that mattered, Kasserine was a defeat. The Germans treated it as one. But the German salvage parties went over the abandoned American positions afterward. They came back with reports that puzzled their own officers. The reports were not really about the tanks. The reports were about the rest of it. Crates of cigarettes were still in factory packaging. Cans of fruit and meat were in such quantity that the salvage parties could not haul them all away in the trucks. They had cartons of chocolate bars. They had coffee in bulk. They had tents. New blankets were in folded stacks. Medical supplies were sufficient by German calculation for an entire division for a month. All these were scattered across an area where a single American battalion had been holding for a week. Personal radios, magazines, letters were everywhere. American war correspondent Ernie Pyle visited one of those areas a few weeks later. It had been retaken. He wrote about what he saw. Equipment, food, paper, personal goods were all scattered across the desert. It was in such volume that the men retaking the position were walking through stacks and drifts of it. The Germans had not bothered to take half of what they had captured. They had been too much. The Wehrmacht had a phrase for this. In the months after Kasserine, in officers' mess conversations and private letters home, it described an army. It was an army that had brought too much with it. It fought as much from its commissary as from its rifle. It was a slightly contemptuous phrase. The implication was that an army that needed chewing gum and fruit cocktail to function was not a serious army. For about 18 months, the Germans believed this. They believed it through the Tunisian campaign. Rommel's successors lost it in May 1943 with 250,000 Axis prisoners. They believed it through Sicily and Salerno. They believed it more carefully through the long, grinding Italian campaign. By the time the Americans came ashore at Normandy in June 1944, German officers in the field had stopped believing that American soldiers were soft. They had been hit too many times by men who fought hard and well, but they still believed almost without exception that the American supply system was a vulnerability. It was too long, it was too dependent on shipping, it was too vulnerable to interdiction. The Ardennes offensive began in December 1944. It was in part a bet on that vulnerability. The German plan was to drive west across the Meuse. They would seize the Belgian port of Antwerp. The Allies had captured Antwerp in early September. If the port could be taken away from them, the Allied advance would, in the German calculation, run out of supply within weeks. The Western Front might be stabilized long enough. German strength could then redirect east against the Russians. The plan failed. By the time the operation collapsed in mid-January 1945, the German army on the Western Front had lost roughly 100,000 men. These were killed, wounded, or captured. The last reserve panzer divisions had been used up. The war in the West was effectively over. But while the offensive was still moving, in the third week of December 1944, German soldiers in the Ardennes were going through pockets of the dead Americans they had killed. They were also going through the supply dumps they had overrun. What they found in those pockets compared sharply to what they had in their own pockets and their own kit. This comparison is worth understanding before we go any further. The German infantrymen in the Ardennes that winter had been on a tobacco ration. It was 6 cigarettes a day per man. This had been in effect since June 1940. Hitler had personally ordered the limit. Hitler was a non-smoker. He genuinely disapproved of the habit, but the Wehrmacht's medical staff had argued that some level of cigarette ration was essential for morale. The compromise had been 6. By late autumn 1944, those 6 cigarettes were unreliable. Supply broke down regularly. Replacements were filler. Sometimes leaf was cut with whatever was available. The standard daily bread issue was a slab of dark rye. Often it was the late war ersatz loaf. It was cut with bran or sawdust to stretch the flour. The Wehrmacht's pre-war bread ration had once been 750 grams of decent rye. By the autumn of 1944, on many sectors of the front, the actual issue was less than half of that. The bread itself was greenish and dense and sour from inferior ingredients. There was canned meat or sausage when the field kitchen could deliver one. There was a small portion of margarine or hazelnut paste. Butter was almost never seen. The coffee, when it existed at all, was an ersatz brew. It was made from chicory or roasted barley. In the worst stretches of the autumn, it was ground acorns. There was no caffeine in any of it. The men running the German supply effort knew this. The men eating it knew it. The German army's supply system had been remarkable in 1939. It was still functional in 1941. But it had been overwhelmed by the geography of its own war. The Eastern Front alone was longer than the entire Western Front. This stretched from Switzerland to the North Sea. Every kilometre the Germans advanced into Russia had to be supplied. This crossed roads, railways, and tracks that had been designed to carry less. They froze, washed out, or were torn up by partisans and air attack. By the second half of 1944, Allied air forces controlled the skies over occupied Europe. The German railway system was systematically dismembered by strategic bombing. Even getting a tin of canned meat from a depot in Germany to a soldier in Belgium was an achievement. Sometimes the achievement happened, often it did not. What was in the American soldier's pocket was not a luxury. It was the standard issue of an army that had decided its young men deserved more. It decided one of its young men sent to fight in a foreign winter forest should be given roughly twice the calories. He received several times the medical supplies. He received many times the personal comforts of the German soldier who would shoot him. This was not coincidence. It was the visible end of a long chain of decisions. Quartermasters, factory managers, food scientists, and war production board planners made these decisions. They were 3,000 miles away. The K-ration was not a single product. It was a coordinated system. Ansel Keys, a physiologist at the University of Minnesota, designed it in 1941. Hundreds of companies manufactured it under federal contract. It was packaged in waxed cardboard. This resisted water, gas, and rough handling. It was built to fit a soldier's pocket. The full daily allotment included 3 boxes. These were labeled breakfast, dinner, and supper. They contained roughly 2,830 calories. Inside each box were canned and packaged staples. These were miniaturized for the field. They were what a man would have eaten if he were home. The breakfast unit contained a small can of chopped ham and eggs. It had a few dense biscuits. It included a compressed cereal or fruit bar, a packet of soluble coffee, sugar tablets, chewing gum, and a 4-pack of cigarettes were also present. The dinner unit substituted processed cheese for the meat. The supper unit contained a different canned meat. This was often a pork loaf. It came with a packet of bouillon powder. Across the 3 boxes there were also a few halazone water purification tablets, a wooden spoon, a small folded sheet of toilet paper, a book of matches, and a small can opener called the P38 were included. The P38 was a piece of stamped steel. It was 1.5 inches long. A soldier could keep it on his Dodd tag chain. The cigarettes inside were standard American brands. Lucky Strikes, Camels, Chesterfields were common. These were the same labels a clerk in Chicago could buy at his lunch counter that same week. The matches in some lots were waterproofed. Beyond the K-ration, other items were not part of the ration system at all. The army had made them standard issue. A small medical pouch on his belt held the brown paper packet of sulfonilamide powder. It was a fine yellowish dust, sulfur, as soldiers called it. A man hit through the leg or the abdomen could pour this powder into his open wound. Or a buddy could do it for him. This was done before the medic arrived. It dramatically reduced his chance of dying from infection. The drug had been discovered by a biochemist named Gerhard Dommarch in the early 1930s. The original commercial form, Prontosil, was a German invention. It was patented in 1935. By the autumn of 1944, the Wehrmacht still had access to sulfur drugs, but quantities at the front had declined. Wounded German soldiers in the Ardennes that winter regularly received nothing for their wounds at all. Aid stations had run out by the middle of December. The American soldier carried his own packet. Every man in the line had one. Behind him in the chain were field medics. They carried larger envelopes. Battalion aid stations stocked industrial quantities. The Germans had invented the drug. The Americans had taken the discovery. They mass-produced it under American patent during the war. They put a personal supply into every infantryman's belt. The second item was a small blast tube. It was about 3 inches long. It had a needle protected by a wire loop. This was the morphine syrette. It was a single-use injector. A wounded man could use it on himself or on a buddy in less than half a minute. Break the loop. Push the wire down to puncture the seal. Push the needle into the thigh. Squeeze the tube. The dose was 30 milligrams of morphine tartrate. It was enough for severe pain. The device was developed by E.R. Squibb and Sons in the late 1930s. It was adopted by the Army in 1940. It was not the only American medical innovation of the war, but it was the one that most often saved a man from going into shock. This happened before he reached an aid station. The German equivalent existed, but by late 1944 it was reserved almost entirely for officers. It was also for the wounded who reached rear hospitals. The man bleeding in the snow rarely got it. These 2 items, a brown paper packet and a glass tube, weighed almost nothing. Together, they represented a level of personal medical care. No army on earth had ever issued this to its private soldiers before. They were standard. Every man in the line had them. They were as ordinary as the chewing gum. Beyond the rations and the medicine were items that did not look like military equipment at all. They looked like fragments of someone's living room. In the wallet of an average American GI, a folded photograph or 2 was often found when he died. The burial party went through his pockets. Sometimes it was a wife. Sometimes it was a girl back home he was not yet engaged to. Sometimes parents on a porch. Sometimes a younger brother in a school uniform. The Army had begun issuing standard cardboard wallets to enlisted men in some commands by 1943. Even where it had not, the men had bought their own at the post exchange. The wallet contained the soldier's identification card. It also had his blood type. His religion was included if he chose to record it. Sometimes a small printed prayer card or a St. Christopher medal was present. A few bills in local currency, issued by the quartermaster, were also there. The country he had come from was visible in his wallet. This could not be hidden. The burial party could read it at a glance. The Germans noticed this. Beside the photographs there was usually mail. A V-mail letter or 2 was found. They were folded thin. They had been read so often the creases had worn through. A V-mail letter is worth understanding. It tells you something specific about the country he had come from. V-mail, short for Victory Mail, was a postal system. The United States adopted it from a British wartime service in June 1942. A serviceman's family wrote a letter on a special pre-printed form. They took it to a local post office. They mailed it. The letter was photographed onto 16mm microfilm at a Kodak processing center. The microfilm was flown across the Atlantic. At a receiving station near the front, the negatives were reprinted onto small photographic paper. This was at about 1/4 of the original size. They were sorted. They were delivered to the soldier in the field. About 1,800 letters fit on the single 100-foot roll of film. The 37 mail bags it would have taken to ship those letters in their original paper form. They weighed more than 2,500 pounds. These were replaced by a single sack. It weighed 45 pounds. Cargo space was saved, weight was saved, time was saved. In 1944, the United States Army handled more than 2 billion pieces of mail. By the end of 1945, that figure was over 3 billion. A letter could leave a kitchen table in Iowa or Oregon. It could reach the field jacket of a soldier in Belgium in 9 days. A German soldier in the Ardennes that winter, going through the pockets of an American he had just killed, could be looking at a letter. It had been written by a woman in the American Midwest. She was still drinking her morning coffee less than a fortnight earlier. There was no equivalent on his own side of the line. The Wehrmacht's postal system to its men in the East by the autumn of 1944 was measured in weeks. The Wehrmacht's postal system to its men in Russia in the worst stretches of 1943 had taken a month or longer. Mail was not the only paper in the dead man's pockets. There was often a small horizontal paperback book. These were not commercial editions. They were the products of a program called the Armed Services Editions. A private non-profit called the Council on Books in wartime ran it. Between 1943 and 1947, it printed approximately 122 million copies of 1,322 unique titles. The format was deliberately small. It was sized to fit in the cargo pocket of a uniform shirt or trouser. The covers were thin paper. The bindings were sewn for durability. They contained novels, short stories, poetry, history, and technical references. Anything an American publisher had produced that the council thought might be useful or comforting or instructive in a foxhole was included. The dead American at the side of a Belgian road in December 1944 might have one of these in his hip pocket, so might his living squad mate 200 meters away. There would also frequently be a small booklet. It was titled Pocket Guide to Germany. Millions were distributed to American forces in the late summer and autumn of 1944. The Pocket Guide was a 48-page War Department publication. It explained the country, the language, the people, the recent history, and the rules of conduct. It told the soldier why he was fighting. It told him what he was likely to find on the other side of the border. It was issued to ordinary infantrymen, not just officers. The dead man might have his copy folded and worn. It would be in an inside pocket of his field jacket. Among officers and a number of airborne troops, there might also be a folded piece of cloth. This was a printed map of the surrounding country. It was large enough to navigate by. It was light enough to weigh almost nothing. It was waterproof. It was silent when crumpled. Most of these maps were printed not on actual silk. They were printed on rayon. This was despite what they were often called. An American program run by the Aeronautical Chart Service did this after late 1942. They were issued primarily to airmen and to special forces, but in the airborne divisions that fought in the Bulge, the 82nd, the 101st, the 17th, many soldiers carried them as well. They were the descendant of a British escape and evasion program managed by an organization called MI9. It had been issuing similar maps to downed airmen since 1940. There were also items that historians and museum curators tend to overlook. They were not exotic. A small bar of soap in commercial packaging with a brand name, a toothbrush, a spare pair of dry wool socks, sometimes 2 pairs, sometimes carried inside the field jacket against the chest to keep the body heat in them, a small tin of foot powder, a pocket knife, a few small denomination coins or bills in local currency issued by the quartermaster, a German staff sergeant going through these things in the snow of a Belgian field. He would not have seen them exactly as luxury. He would have seen them as evidence of a country that had not been bombed, evidence of a country whose factories and farms and shipping lanes still worked, evidence of a country whose soldiers were not being sent to the front to make do with whatever the supply train could spare. Evidence of a country that had decided somewhere in its institutional memory that a young man asked to die for it should be given every comfort the country could spare him. This was without compromising his ability to fight. The Germans did not have any of this. By the autumn of 1944, they could not have produced any of it even if they had wanted to. The reasons for this disparity were not simple. They reduced to 2 enormous facts. The first was the Eastern Front. From June of 1941 onward, the Wehrmacht had placed 2/3 or more of its strength in Russia at any given moment. The Eastern Front had consumed German manpower at a rate no army in modern times has been able to absorb. By the time American forces landed in Normandy in June of 1944, German military casualties on the Eastern Front totaled more than 3 million men. This combined killed, wounded, missing, and captured. The men who died first in any army are the men who lead from the front. The German divisions facing the Americans in the Ardennes that winter were in many cases hollowed out. The Volksgrenadier divisions, raised in the second half of 1944, were filled with men over 40. They were filled with men under 18. They included transferred Luftwaffe ground crews who had never been infantry. They also include Kriegsmarine sailors whose ships no longer existed. They were given hasty training. This was often less than 3 months. They went forward with whatever equipment was available. This meant a confusing mixture of standard German rifles, captured Soviet weapons, and old French rifles dating from 1940. The second fact was the home front. Germany had been bombed continuously since 1942. By the end of the war, Allied air raids would kill somewhere in the range of 400,000 German civilians. This figure varies between roughly 350,000 and 600,000, depending on the historian and the methodology. Industrial production was being maintained at high levels. Albert Speer, the Minister of Armaments, led this. He had taken over the role in 1942. He had overseen what came to be called the armaments miracle, but the conditions for the civilian population had collapsed. Food rationing for civilians fell to between roughly 1,600 and 2,000 calories a day for most of the population by the winter of 1944 to 45. Coffee was effectively unavailable in any real form. Sugar was rationed below subsistence. Tobacco was a luxury bought and sold on the black market. Speer himself understood. He had a clarity that Hitler and most of the senior Nazi leadership refused to share. The war could not be won on the basis of armaments output alone. The figures his ministry knew were industrial figures. He tried at various points in 1944 to communicate them to Hitler. They were not battlefield figures. American steel production in 1944 reached approximately 80 million tons. German steel production, including the output of all occupied territories, was approximately 18 to 22 million tons. American aircraft production for 1944 exceeded 96,000 units. German aircraft production at its frantic late war peak reached just under 40,000. The Liberty ship program was launching merchant vessels at a peak rate. It exceeded 120 hulls a month at its high point. An output the German submarine fleet could not have sunk. This was true even if it had been at full operational strength. By 1944, it was no longer. What Speer was trying to make Hitler understand was that the war was not really being fought on the battlefield anymore. It was being fought in factories the Germans could not bomb, by workers the Germans could not kill, on a continent the Germans could not reach. By the time of the Ardennes offensive, Speer was telling close associates privately that the war was already lost. It had been lost since at least Normandy. He kept producing weapons at impressive rates. He no longer believed the weapons would matter. This was the situation when German soldiers in the Ardennes that December bent down to search the pockets of the American dead, the chocolate bar, the cigarettes, the morphine, the sulfur, the photographs, the letters 9 days old, the small soap with a brand name on it, the dry pair of socks, the booklets and the maps and the wooden spoons. None of these were what the German soldier had been told to expect. He had been told for years in the official German press that the Americans were a soft and selfish people. They were a money-chasing nation that would not stand in a real fight. The propaganda had a phrase for the wealth of the American war effort that was quietly contemptuous. By the winter of 1944 in the field, the contempt was harder to sustain. How did it actually happen? How does a country in the space of half a generation build the industrial machinery to put 4 ounces of pressed chocolate, a glass syrette of morphine, a packet of sulfur powder, a bar of branded soap, a photograph of a wife, and a letter 9 days old into the pocket of every one of the millions of men it sent overseas? The answer is 100 years of decisions. A country that had built its railroads in the 1870s and its automotive industry in the 1910s and its chemical industry in the 1920s was a country that had almost without noticing accumulated the technical foundations to do what was being asked of it in 1944. The Hershey factory in Pennsylvania did not appear out of nowhere. It was built on the back of a sugar processing industry that had been refined for 50 years. The Kodak microfilm process that powered V-mail was built on photographic technology that had been improved for 40 years. The morphine syrette was the product of a pharmaceutical manufacturing capacity that had been growing since the 1890s. The standardized waxed cardboard of the K-ration box was built on a paper and packaging industry that by 1940 was the largest in the world. When the war came, none of these industries had to be invented from scratch. They had to be redirected. Detroit's automobile assembly lines were retooled to make tanks and jeeps and aircraft engines. Hershey's chocolate lines were retooled to make ration bars. Squibb's pharmaceutical plants added syrette production. Kodak's photographic engineers built the V-mail microfilm cameras. The country that put 4 pounds of supplies in a private soldier's pocket on a Belgian morning in 1944 was not improvising. It was harvesting decades of accumulated industrial choices all at once. It poured the harvest into the pockets of its young men. Germany had built remarkable things in those same decades. German chemistry, German optics, German mechanical engineering had at various times led the world. The Tiger tank that some of the German divisions in the Ardennes were equipped with was a more powerful weapon than the American Sherman. Gun for gun, the MG-42 machine gun fired faster than any American equivalent. German submarine technology, jet aircraft technology, rocket technology, in some cases led the world. None of that mattered when an American private opened a wax box and pulled out a piece of milk chocolate. The box was not really a piece of food. It was the visible end of a continent's worth of decisions about what a soldier was worth. The German soldiers who searched those bodies understood. Not all of them, maybe not the part of them that was still trying to do their duty. That part was still loading rifles and listening for orders and staying alive, but some part understood what the box meant, and what the photograph meant, and what the letter meant. Some part of them knew that they were not really fighting an army. They were fighting a country. And the country had reached them. It reached them in the form of the small, ordinary, mass-produced objects in the pockets of the dead. The great public investigations of the German army's defeat have all reached for explanations. These involve strategy, leadership, weapons, the Eastern Front, the failures of Hitler's command. Those explanations are real. They are correct as far as they go. But on the ground, in the snow, in the fields where the men who actually fought were also the men who actually died, there was a quieter explanation. And it was sitting in a pocket. It was 4 ounces of pressed chocolate that tasted a little better than a boiled potato. It was a brown paper packet of yellowish powder. It was a photograph of someone's mother. It was a letter from Iowa that had crossed the Atlantic in 9 days. It was a country folded down to the size of a paperback novel. It was in the inside pocket of a field jacket. It was the visible evidence that the Reich was no longer fighting another army. It was fighting the entire industrial output of an unbombed continent, item by item in the pockets of dead 20-year-olds. That is what stunned them, not the food, not the morphine, not the photographs taken on their own. It was the realization when those things came out of the pockets of the dead and were laid out for what they were. The 4 pounds of supplies they were looking at were not a soldier's loadout. They were a verdict. The country that had filled those pockets had already won, and the men searching them had been looking at the proof in their hands all along. The men who carried those pockets, the actual men, the riflemen and the medics and the truck drivers and the radio operators, did not know they were carrying a verdict. They thought they were carrying lunch. They thought they were carrying a chocolate bar that did not taste very good, and a packet of powder that the medic had told them might save their life, and a photograph of a girl they hoped to marry when they got home. They did not know that the small ordinary things in their inside pockets were the heaviest thing on the battlefield. They were just trying to stay warm and to keep moving, and to not die in a country whose name they could barely pronounce. Most of them came home, some of them did not. The ones who did came back to a country that, having organized itself to fight a war by being more comfortable than it had ever been, never quite stopped being that country. The Hershey factory kept making chocolate. The Squibb laboratories kept making medicine. The mail kept moving. The infrastructure that had filled the pockets of their fathers and brothers became the infrastructure of their own peacetime lives. The highways they drove on, the supermarkets they shopped in, the hospitals where their children would be born. The pockets had been the seed. The country that had planted that seed was the country they all grew old in. The ones who did not come home are buried, most of them, in cemeteries in Belgium and France and Italy and the Pacific, under simple white markers that give a unit and a date and a name. Whatever was in their pockets when they died has long been collected, sorted, returned to families, lost, or in some cases, preserved in the museum cases I mentioned at the start of this video. You can still see them, the wax K-ration boxes, the brown sulfur packets, the small glass syrettes. These are in the National World War II Museum in New Orleans. They are also at the Hershey Community Archives in Pennsylvania. They are at the Imperial War Museum in London. They are at small regimental museums in towns across Europe. They are very small, those things. They do not look like much. They are the most important objects of the 20th century. These small boxes quietly spoke volumes.